The paper plate bent in my hand, grease pooling in the middle. The beer Mark had given me was warm, bitter, and cheap, but I forced it down while trying to stay invisible in the corner of his brand-new living room. The walls were freshly painted, the floors polished to a shine, and his in-laws moved about like they owned the place. I could feel their eyes flicker over me, my plain dress, my worn shoes, as if I were some unwanted guest rather than family. Then Mark clinked his bottle against a glass and raised his voice. His grin stretched wide, the kind of grin that always meant trouble when we were kids. "A toast," he announced, puffing up his chest, "to finally achieving the American dream. A real home, not some cramped rental." His eyes slid over the crowd and landed on me, sharp and cruel. He paused, letting the silence grow heavy. Then he smirked. "I guess not everyone can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Maybe one day, little sis." The room erupted in laughter. His wife Brittany pressed her hand over her mouth as though she wanted to soften it, but her eyes sparkled with the same superiority. His in-laws laughed the loudest, delighted by the joke. My parents stood awkwardly near the kitchen, pretending not to hear, pretending it was all harmless fun. For me, it was a slap I couldn't dodge. I smiled faintly, because that's what I had trained myself to do, but my stomach twisted. I gripped the flimsy plate so hard it almost snapped. My face felt hot, my ears rang. I wanted to vanish, to melt into the walls, but I stood frozen, trapped in the spotlight of his cruelty. Mark raised his bottle higher, basking in his own glory, while I stared at the half-eaten food on my plate, wishing I could disappear. That moment was not just another insult. It was a reminder of every time he had been the favored child, every time my parents excused his failures and demanded more from me. It was the echo of broken promises, the $30,000 I had given him when he swore he'd pay me back, the years of silence when he vanished with my sacrifice. It was all there packed into that one line, that one smirk, that one eruption of laughter at my expense. I stood there quietly, swallowing the anger, the shame, the sharp sting of being mocked in front of strangers. But inside, something shifted. His words carved a mark deep inside me, and I knew I could never let it go. That night, when the laughter finally died down and the party ended, I walked out of that perfect suburban house with my head low, but my resolve burning. He thought it was just a joke. He thought it was just another dig at the sister he never respected. But he had no idea that in humiliating me so publicly, he had lit the first spark of his own downfall. When I think back to when we were kids, the pattern was always there. Mark didn't have to try very hard to shine. He was the type who could walk into a room, crack a smile, and win people over. Teachers loved him, neighbors praised him, and our parents, Robert and Linda, treated him like he was made of gold. He played basketball, not particularly great, but enough to earn cheers. A single good game, and he was the star of the house. I was different. I preferred books, quiet corners, and long afternoons spent studying. While he was out joking with friends, I was doing homework. Still, when I brought home good grades, they nodded as if it was expected, nothing to celebrate. A well done for him was fireworks. For me, it was, why not an A+ instead of an A? Mark's mistakes vanished like smoke. When he forgot chores, Dad chuckled and did them himself. When he broke Mom's vase, she sighed and said it was just an accident. But if I misplaced a single thing, the scolding would echo through the house. Their eyes always seemed heavier when they looked at me, as though I carried a burden he never would. I remember one summer, Mark borrowed Dad's car. He came home late, bumper scratched, headlights cracked. My father laughed, shook his head, and muttered, "Boys will be boys." The next week, I brought home a test with a B+. It wasn't failing, not even close, but the disappointment in their faces burned more than any punishment. "You can do better, Chloe," Mom said, and Dad nodded with a sigh. That moment taught me what I meant in comparison to him. The reliable one, the one who wasn't allowed to stumble. It wasn't only about school or sports. At family gatherings, relatives would ask about Mark first. His stories, his plans, his wins. Everyone leaned in, smiling. When it was my turn, conversations drifted away. People checked their watches, filled their plates again, or turned back to him. It was like I was the background to his spotlight. Even as kids, I noticed how he used this to his advantage. If he wanted something, he just asked, and it appeared. A new bike, a trip with friends, money for a game. If I asked, it came with questions, conditions, and a list of what I owed back in effort. I learned early to stop asking. Mark grew up with doors opening for him. I grew up learning to push through locked ones. That favoritism shaped everything between us. And though I stayed quiet, I never forgot the balance. Each little moment stacked on the last, building something inside me I didn't yet have words for. It wasn't jealousy, it was clarity. From childhood, I understood where I stood, and where he was placed high above me, on a pedestal he never truly earned. When our grandfather died, the house felt emptier than it ever had. He had been the one person who noticed me without comparing me to Mark. After the funeral, the lawyer gathered us and read the will. To my surprise, grandfather had left both of us an equal share, 30,000 each. For me, it wasn't just money. It was a path forward, a way to finally breathe without counting every coin. I was working nights, dragging myself to classes in the morning, barely holding on. That inheritance felt like a lifeline. Mark, on the other hand, was already settled into his job at the dealership. He had his wife, his plans, and a steady income. I thought he would tuck his share away or spend it on another upgrade for himself. But a week later, he showed up at my door with Brittany beside him, both of them looking frantic. He spoke fast, almost breathless. "Chloe, we found a place. It's perfect. But if we don't put the money down now, it'll be gone. Brittany's pregnant, and we can't lose this chance. Please, I just need your share. Just for a year. I'll give it back with extra." His words came out rehearsed, but his face was convincing. He painted pictures of a nursery, of stability, of how desperate they were. Brittany rested her hand on her stomach, silent but effective. I wanted to say no, to keep the little security I had, but the thought of turning them away when a child was involved made me feel selfish. I asked him twice if he was certain he could pay it back. He nodded without hesitation, swore he'd sign something if I needed. I didn't even push for it. He was my brother. Family, I thought, didn't need contracts. So I signed over my portion. I can still remember the way he hugged me afterward, telling me I'd saved them, promising that I wouldn't regret it. At that moment, I believed I had done the right thing. I imagined him paying me back the following year, interest included, and me finally being able to finish school without living on scraps. I even felt proud of myself for being generous, for stepping in when he needed me. But deep down, there was a faint unease I ignored. Something about the way he avoided my eyes after I handed him the paperwork, how quickly he changed the subject once it was done. I brushed it aside, convincing myself I was being paranoid. He was my brother, and he said he'd return it. That decision became the line where everything shifted. What I thought was kindness turned into the start of a wound that would never close easily. At the time, I didn't know it was the last moment I would ever truly trust him. The first year passed slowly, and I waited with patience I could barely afford. I reminded myself that promises took time, that maybe he truly needed space. When the deadline arrived, I reached out carefully, expecting at least some effort. Instead, he waved it off with a smooth explanation. His sales had dipped, things were tight, but he'd settle it soon. I let it go, telling myself he meant well. Months stretched into another year. Each time I brought it up, his answers shifted like smoke. One moment, it was an unexpected bill. Another, it was repairs on the house. Once, he claimed medical costs, his tone heavy as though I'd be cruel to even question it. I wanted to believe him, but the stories didn't line up. Still, I held back my doubts. I clung to the hope that my brother wouldn't lie to me outright. But then the distance grew wider. Calls went unanswered. Messages stayed unread. When I showed up at his house one evening, Brittany answered the door, her smile tight and her words clipped. "It's not a good time." Behind her, I could see the glow of their new television, the fresh furniture, the life that had come from money that was meant to help me survive. I tried again and again, softer each time, as if being gentler would make him listen. Eventually, he disappeared into silence. It was as though I had never given him anything at all. My voice, my effort, my trust, none of it reached him. When I turned to my parents for support, their response cut nearly as deep as his betrayal. My father folded his arms, muttering that I should let it go. My mother said I was making trouble, that family doesn't keep score. They wanted peace, even if it meant I swallowed the loss. Every word from them made me feel smaller, as though I was the one who had done wrong by asking for what was mine. Meanwhile, my own life was shrinking. I juggled shifts at 2 jobs, trying to cover tuition and rent in a crumbling studio apartment. The ceiling leaked whenever it rained, and I'd set out bowls to catch the drops before falling asleep on a mattress that sagged in the middle. I told myself I could endure it because better days were coming, though deep down I knew those better days had been stolen. Through it all, Mark thrived. He threw barbecues, posted pictures of vacations, paraded the image of success. And every time I saw it, the bitter truth hardened inside me. My sacrifice had built his comfort. He had vanished from my life, but the shadow of what I had given him never left mine. That night after the housewarming, I went back to my tiny place and let everything crash down on me. I lay on the floor in the dark, shaking, because the humiliation had gone deeper than I could hide. For hours I couldn't stop the tears, but when morning came, something inside me hardened. I told myself I would never let him or anyone else see me so powerless again. I stopped waiting for apologies or miracles. I didn't ask for help anymore, not from family, not from anyone. I had nothing but my determination, and I decided it would be enough. I thought about the few people I'd met in college who had real drive, who had built themselves into something more. One name stood out, Arthur. He had been one of my professors, sharp and demanding, with a reputation for pushing students to their limits. I knew he wasn't kind, but he was brilliant, and I needed someone like that to strip away whatever weakness was left in me. I contacted him, half expecting no reply, but he answered with an offer. It wasn't glamorous, hours of dry, complicated work that paid almost nothing. Most people wouldn't have bothered, but I grabbed it with both hands. If he was giving me even scraps, it meant he saw a spark of use in me, and I wasn't going to waste it. The days blurred into one another. I worked my shifts, came home, and opened spreadsheets and reports until my eyes burned. I studied every number, every trick, until the patterns began to make sense. Arthur didn't praise me, not once, but he kept giving me more. That was all I needed to know I was moving forward. I cut my expenses to nothing. My meals were plain and repetitive, my clothes secondhand, my social life non-existent. Every dollar I saved went straight into building a base for myself. There were nights I sat at my desk so hungry my hands shook, but I told myself that hunger was proof of progress. Slowly, I could feel myself changing. The girl who had once waited around for fairness was gone. In her place was someone sharper, someone who could think strategically, who could endure discomfort without breaking. The bitterness I carried turned into fuel, driving me further than I thought I could go. Arthur became less of a teacher and more of a test I had to survive. Every task he gave me was heavier than the last, but each one toughened me. I learned not just the work but the mindset, how to move quietly, how to spot weaknesses, how to turn pressure into advantage. It wasn't fast and it wasn't easy, but with every small step, I felt the ground shift. I wasn't just enduring anymore. I was preparing, and though no one else could see it, I knew I was laying the stones for something far larger than survival. Arthur was not a man who handed out compliments, so when he finally called me into his office, I braced myself for criticism. Instead, he slid a folder across the desk and said he was starting a firm of his own. He wanted me to be part of it, not as an assistant, but as a partner. My name would be small, tucked under his, but it was still a place at the table. I walked out of that room with my pulse racing. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was being trusted with real power. The work changed overnight. Gone were the endless spreadsheets for pennies. Now we dealt with people who had more money than they knew what to do with, old families, foreign investors, men and women who wanted their fortunes to grow quietly, without questions. Arthur handled the negotiations, but I managed the numbers behind the scenes. My job was to make their wealth move in ways they barely noticed, yet always benefited from. I became invisible by design. To the clients, I was no one, just a name on an email or a silent presence in meetings. That anonymity gave me freedom. I studied their patterns, how they trusted certain words, how fear could be turned into opportunity. I discovered loopholes in markets that others ignored, places where money could multiply with little risk if handled with care. Arthur watched closely, testing me with increasingly complex accounts. I never refused, never hesitated. What I lacked in charm, I made up for in precision. He came to rely on my calculations, my ability to predict outcomes before others even noticed a change. I didn't just crunch numbers anymore. I planned moves like a chess player, always thinking 3 steps ahead. In that world, hesitation meant loss. I learned to make decisions quickly, to strip emotion from every choice. The timid student I once was faded away. I began to see myself as a strategist, someone shaping outcomes rather than waiting for them. Arthur noticed the change, though he never said it outright. Instead, he started leaving more of the firm's future in my hands, letting me guide projects without oversight. Money began to flow in, more than I had ever imagined touching. I didn't waste it. While others in my position might have splurged, I stayed disciplined. I invested quietly, layering accounts and building safety nets that only I controlled. Each step tightened the ground under my feet. The turning point wasn't just about income, it was about identity. I no longer saw myself as the overlooked sibling or the desperate student. I had entered a new field entirely, one where my skills mattered more than family ties or old wounds. Still, beneath the surface, the memory of betrayal never left me. As I rose in this world of hidden fortunes, I knew exactly why I was building this strength, and who it was ultimately for. 2 years passed after that humiliating night in Mark's living room, and everything about my life looked different. I no longer worried about whether I could pay rent or buy groceries. I had savings stacked neatly in accounts under names no one but I and Arthur knew. I had networks, clients, knowledge, and most importantly, the calm confidence of someone who could stand on her own. But I wasn't satisfied with stability alone. The thought of Mark's smirk still lived in me, like a splinter buried too deep to ignore. It wasn't enough to rise above him. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he had done. That chance came in the most ordinary way. A mutual acquaintance, someone I barely spoke to, mentioned Mark's newest big idea over coffee. He said Mark was trying to break into commercial real estate, a field he clearly didn't understand. My acquaintance laughed, saying Mark thought he'd make a fortune buying and flipping a rundown property. On the surface, the building looked promising, but anyone with real experience could see it was a disaster waiting to happen. The mortgage was too heavy, the repairs endless, and the timing completely wrong. I asked questions casually, pretending mild interest. The more details I heard, the clearer it became. Mark was drowning before he had even begun. Yet, instead of pulling back, he was hunting for someone reckless enough to pour money into his plan. That's when the idea formed. This wasn't just an opportunity. It was the exact door I had been waiting for. Arthur had taught me long ago how to stay unseen while pulling strings. Through him, I had already established a shell company, a clean front that no one could trace back to me. It was meant for discreet investments, but now it had a far sharper use. Through that company, I stepped into Mark's deal. My involvement came through documents and signatures, never a face-to-face meeting. To him, I was only a silent partner with deep pockets, the answer to his desperate prayers. Mark welcomed the mystery investor with open arms. He had no idea he was letting me inside the very heart of his fragile empire. I read every page of the contract he so carelessly signed, every line he skimmed over in his rush to get cash. He thought he had outsmarted someone, found a way to cover his risks without consequences. In truth, he had tied himself to me with ropes he wouldn't see until it was too late. As I signed the final papers, a quiet satisfaction settled over me. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was steady, precise, like fitting the last piece of a puzzle. For years I had carried the sting of his betrayal, the shame of his public mockery, the silence of my parents. Now, finally, I was no longer just remembering. I was moving. Mark believed he was building his future. What he didn't know was that he had built a stage, and I was the one behind the curtain, arranging every scene. He didn't see the trap, because arrogance kept his eyes closed. And I didn't rush. Revenge, after all, is not about speed. It's about timing, patience, and letting the other person walk willingly into the snare. By the time he realized whose hands held the strings, it would already be too late. And that thought alone gave me more peace than all the money I had ever earned. From the very start, the building Mark had bought was nothing but trouble. On paper, it looked like a quick profit. In reality, it was an empty shell that demanded more money every week. The first tenants who signed letters of intent backed out as soon as they saw the condition of the place. Others came to tour but walked away after spotting the cracked foundation, leaking pipes, and unsafe wiring. What Mark thought would be a steady stream of rental income turned into vacant halls echoing with silence. Repairs became his next battle. Every corner of that property hid a new disaster. One broken pipe revealed another. An inspection uncovered mold that stretched across entire walls. The roof leaked, and the cost of fixing it alone rivaled what he had already spent on the down payment. Contractors demanded upfront payment, then abandoned the site half-finished when he couldn't keep up. The deeper he dug, the faster the ground collapsed beneath him. To cover the endless bills, Mark began draining his resources. He emptied savings accounts, cashed out small investments, and even pulled equity from his own house. Brittany's face in public grew tight and strained, though she smiled through gritted teeth. To friends, Mark pretended everything was fine, boasting about his big project. Behind closed doors, he was already bleeding dry. Through all of this, the paperwork he had signed with my company stood waiting. He had skimmed through those contracts with the same arrogance he carried his whole life. Hidden in the fine print were deadlines, penalties, and clauses he never cared to notice. At first, the demands were light, routine payments, interest exactly as written. He barely noticed the weight. But as his property consumed more of his income, those payments began to feel heavier. When he missed one, I enforced the terms with precision. No mercy, no grace periods, no friendly reminders. Every missed deadline triggered another fee. Every shortfall snowballed into a larger sum. Letters arrived on his doorstep stamped with urgency. Phone calls pressed him for what he owed. He tried to push back, but the agreements were airtight. He had signed away the flexibility he thought he'd always have. Panic crept into his decisions. He begged banks for loans, but his credit was already strained. He called old contacts, promising returns he could never guarantee. He even tried to bring in new investors, but no one wanted to touch a project sinking that fast. Each door slammed in his face, and still my company pressed forward, inch by inch tightening the rope. What made it sharper was that Mark didn't know whose hands held the chain. To him, it was just a faceless firm, another nameless creditor demanding what was due. He cursed the letters, cursed the people on the other end of the calls, never once realizing that his own sister was the one behind the curtain. As months passed, he grew thinner, his voice rough from constant arguments. His once proud posture slumped under the pressure. He had built his life on the idea that charm and confidence could fix anything. Now, charm meant nothing. Numbers ruled, and the numbers were mine. Each day he sank deeper, the water closing over his head. And though he kicked and clawed, the truth remained. The deal he thought would make him powerful had become the chain dragging him down, and I was the one keeping it tight. It was late in the evening when I heard the knock. The sound was uneven, hurried, as though the person on the other side could barely hold themselves together. I opened the door, and there he was, Mark. The same brother who had ignored my calls for years, who had laughed at me in front of others, now stood on my doorstep looking smaller than I had ever seen him. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes carried deep shadows, the kind carved by sleepless nights and endless worry. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He seemed unsure of how to begin, shifting on his feet like a child caught in trouble. Then the words spilled out in a rush. "Chloe, you have to help me. I'm going to lose everything. The house, the business, everything's about to collapse." His voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time in my life, I saw him without his mask of confidence. I let him inside, not because I felt pity, but because I wanted to hear him say more. He paced the room, explaining his situation with frantic gestures, trying to make it sound like circumstances beyond his control. He spoke of banks refusing him, of contractors demanding money he didn't have, of Brittany threatening to leave if things got worse. Every sentence was laced with panic. I sat still, letting his desperation fill the room. Then, when he finally stopped for air, I leaned forward. My voice was calm, almost gentle, but my words cut sharper than any anger could. "It's a shame," I said. "Not everyone can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Or keep one." The silence that followed was heavy. He froze, his face paling as the memory of his own cruelty flashed back at him. His lips parted, but no sound came. For the first time, I watched him realize who had been holding the strings of his downfall. I didn't shout, I didn't gloat. Instead, I reminded him of the inheritance he had begged from me years ago. $30,000, Mark, I said evenly. With interest, of course. A drop compared to what you owe now, but still mine. His eyes widened, flickering with disbelief. He whispered, "It was you." The question wasn't really a question. He already knew the answer. He sank into a chair, shoulders slumping, his hands trembling as he buried his face in them. I told him plainly, "You always said family doesn't keep score. But business does. And this is business." There was no pleasure in saying it, only a steady satisfaction, the kind that comes from setting a crooked line straight. He had mocked me, used me, and dismissed me. Now he sat in my living room with nothing left to bargain with. He begged then, voice cracking, promising he'd change, swearing he'd make it right. But the power had shifted completely. I wasn't the younger sister seeking approval anymore. I was the creditor, the strategist, the one who had learned patience well enough to let him walk into his own ruin. The man who once stood above me in every room now sat at my mercy. And I didn't need to raise my voice to make him understand. The reckoning had arrived, not with anger or violence, but with quiet certainty. He finally knew what it felt like to be powerless. I watched him struggle quietly, unaware that every move he made reminded him of the arrangement he could never escape. Each month's payment was a small chain, invisible yet unbreakable, tying him to a reality he could not change. From my new home, I could see the world differently, living without the weight of uncertainty or fear. The house was light-filled, every corner designed to bring calm and clarity. Here, I felt in control of my own life, untouched by past grievances. Neighbors greeted me with warmth, unaware of the past drama that had shaped my choices. I focused on routines that nurtured stability, morning walks, small tasks, quiet evenings on the balcony. My days were orderly, filled with small victories and private satisfaction. The peace I had gained was subtle but deep, a constant undercurrent beneath everyday life. It was not about gloating or reminding anyone of failures. It was about establishing a life that was mine, built carefully and deliberately. Business, once a battlefield, became a tool for strategy rather than anger. I learned to observe without reacting, to plan without haste, and to act without emotion clouding judgment. My parents noticed the change in me, though they could not fully understand it. I no longer sought approval or validation. My satisfaction was internal, quiet, and unshakable. Every decision I made reinforced my position and taught me the value of patience and precision. I invested in my surroundings, not just in walls and furniture, but in routines and habits that reinforced calm and purpose. Small touches, like organized shelves and a tidy garden, reflected a life controlled and intentional. Evenings were spent in thought, reviewing progress and envisioning growth. Every choice mattered, and every choice contributed to a sense of mastery over circumstances. No one else needed to know the depth of my satisfaction. The power I felt was in living unbothered, in knowing I had set everything in motion to remain secure and steady. Life unfolded in deliberate, measured steps, and I moved forward with confidence, building a new foundation that could never be shaken. My world was now defined not by revenge, but by quiet authority and careful, thoughtful living, a structure as solid as the home I had created for myself. This existence, calm and untroubled, became my greatest reward, a life of purpose, order, and enduring control. Do you think taking control quietly, like in this story, was the right way to handle a problem? Or do you think forgiveness would have been better? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Your opinion really matters. And if you want more stories about clever strategies and life lessons, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any updates.